Take science, add the age of equality and the age of gender equality, plus the idea of a male and female nature. The notion that there's a male and female brain is not only not obvious, but it's considered downright objectionable by many who think that gender differences are born and not created by systemic societal rules and sexism. In tonight's contribution to TVO's special Mysteries of the Mind series, we're examining what science tells us about gender differences. Are we getting closer to the answer about the nature of our nature? Are we shaped by our beliefs about gender or by our gendered hormones? TVO will air the BBC documentary Is Your Brain Male or Female? Right after this program. First, to help us with these tricky questions and guide through the thicket of science and statistics, we welcome in Tel Aviv, Israel, via Skype, Daphna Joel, chair of the Psychobiology graduate program at Tel Aviv University. In Baltimore, Maryland, Margaret McCarthy, chair of the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And with us here in studio, Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And as I welcome our three guests to tonight's discussion, I ask you off the top just to get comfortable, because we are going to play an excerpt from the BBC documentary that I just mentioned, and then we're going to list 6 differences between men or women as selected by Steven Pinker. So all of that still to come. Mr. Director, if you would, let's roll that clip first.
Men.
And women.
For centuries, people have argued ferociously about whether or not we are born with different brains.
We have different roles in life, and I think that's why our brains are wired differently.
Men are definitely better at navigation and map reading.
Women panic a little bit more.
From experience, no.
Now it seems we're getting close to an answer.
I thought there must be a mistake. I'm not used to results of studies coming out as clean as this one.
With new technology, scientists have recently identified subtle differences in the brains of men and women.
It's more granular.
Differences that could help explain perceived strengths and weaknesses.
I was surprised that they were so significantly different.
Come on, spare brain!
But the research is controversial and raises difficult questions.
Funny, but he's completely uninterested in the dolls.
Are brain differences innate?
Or are they shaped by the world around us?
The rest of the documentary right after we get off the air here on the agenda. Now, here is the Montreal-born Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker with his 6 differences between men and women, and they are: men care more about status, number 1. Men value things and rules, women value people, that's number 2. Men take greater risks, number 3. Men are better at spatial visualization, 4. Men score better at mathematical reasoning, women score better at calculation, that's 5. And the last one, men do better and worse on all tests of math, space, and science. Let's get into whether or not this is more nature or nurture. Margaret, why don't you start us off in Baltimore? Which of these from this list strike you as more nature than nurture?
Well, I would say the very last one is a combination of nature and nurture, in that Dr. Pinkert is correct in that males do populate the extremes of abilities when we think about something such as mathematical ability. They score a higher percentage of the worst scores and a very small higher percentage of the highest scores. However, it used to be back in about the early 1990s that the ratio of mathematically gifted individuals was 12-to-1 boys to girls. However, in the intervening decades, with early interventions to identify girls who are mathematically gifted and to nurture them along in the process, that ratio has dropped to 4-to-1. So that obviously showed that there was a lot going on culturally that was setting up that strong bias in male favor. The question now is that 4-to-1 truly biological, or do we still just have a ways to go on the cultural end? But again, his statement was rather broad in that it said in all scientific tests, and I think that's not well grounded in any data I know of. Science is very broad and includes things like plant biology, genetics, anatomy, biology, ornithology, mammalogy, etc. And I would certainly say that was a rather bombastic statement.
Some great ideas there, which we shall unpack over the course of the program. Daphna Joel, how do you come down on that issue of what's nature and what's nurture from that list?
Well, I want to start with a comment about the list itself, which is very male biased. So we have 4 that is only relating to male, and not 2 things that in which he relates both to males and females. So I think it's an interesting gender effect. But he has this, when he thinks about gender, he thinks about what men are different than women, and about the things that men are good at. And regarding the question of nature versus nurture, I don't think we can actually answer this question in humans. There is no way to disentangle them. And I think the more interesting question is, why are we so obsessed with this question of whether this is nature or nurture? Because if we think one of these things on the list is important for men or for women, then it's important for humans. And then regardless of whether the difference is because of nature or nurture, we should cancel this difference. So we should do whatever we can do with the environment to cancel it out. So I don't know why we are looking to justify these differences by claiming that this is nature.
Jordan, let me follow up on that issue of gender bias, which Daphna Joel has suggested. And as you look at the list goes men care, men value, men take, men are better. Is there a bias in Steven Pinker's list to begin with?
Well, there's a bias in the use of gender-related pronouns, apparently. Whether the bias makes men look more favorable than women, I think, is a more important issue, and it isn't self-evident to me that it does. The fact that men, for example, appear to be more interested in things than people could be viewed either way, as positive or negative. I think many people would view it as negative. The idea that men take more risks, well, that can make them heroes or prison inmates, and that is often what happens. So I think if you're trying to discuss gender differences in a forum that's going to be public, whether it's written or spoken, you have to be careful about the terminology that you use, because otherwise you tangle up the debate or the discussion in issues that are probably less directly relevant.
Okay, in which case, nature versus nurture, as you look at the list, where do you more often than not come down?
Well, the things versus people difference is pretty solid, I think. The best evidence that that's not culturally conditioned is the fact that the biggest differences in occupational preference in the world now are in the Scandinavian countries. And one of the places where that gender difference is biggest is choice between engineering and nursing. So it's 20-to-1 male to female in engineering and 20-to-1 female to male in nursing. And that's despite a fair bit of effort on the Scandinavians' part to equalize that. The risk-taking and status is more complex. I think women are very status-oriented, but I don't believe that female dominance hierarchies have the same criteria that male dominance hierarchies have. So males might be more physically aggressive in pursuing their status. I think there's no doubt about that. The rate of murder between men, for example, especially young men, it absolutely swamps, it overwhelms the murder rate between young women, for example, which is virtually non-existent.
So that must be nature as opposed to nurture, in your view.
Well, yes, I think it's probably nature. It's common among so many males of so many species, and you have to think about people from a biological perspective. I think it's important to think about people from a biological perspective when you're having a discussion like this.
Margaret McCarthy, anything you heard there that you want to come back on?
Well, so my research program focuses on animals, so I can exclude the impacts of nature and culture, and so I can really hone in on the biological influences. And I think there we can get insight into things like male aggression, and he's absolutely right that males are more aggressive across the board in most species. But again, aggression is always context dependent. So in our research on rodents, everybody knows that if you want the most aggressive animal possible, you get a female who's got pups that she's lactating. So it's that maternal aggression is the most intense. So again, it's context dependent, but that is still an important biological difference. Females aren't hyper aggressive when they're not defending their pups. Males are aggressive when they're defending their territory and things of that sort. So the behavior might be the same, but the factors that are regulating it are quite different, and again are based in evolutionary origins for protecting one's reproductive resources.
Daphna Joel, I saw your TED Talk in which you assert that the differences between a male brain and a female brain, so-called, are really almost non-existent, and that you prefer instead to think of it as and I forget the term that you used, but it's basically both genders in one brain together. Could you make that case for our viewers, please?
Yes. So it's a little more complex than this. So there are differences between the brains of males and brains of females, group differences, and you can see many differences actually, and we've seen them. But what you can see is a typical male brain and a typical female brain in an actual human being. So there is no person that has only male characteristics or only female characteristics. Each one of us has both characteristics that are more prevalent or prevalent in males and characteristics that are more prevalent in females. In this sense, there are no male brains and female brains, although everyone has a brain.
And what did you call it when you see both of those?
Right, mosaic. So each one is an individual mosaic of both features that are more prevalent in males and features that are more prevalent in females.
Now, I gather this is a fairly controversial thing to assert. So when you put that out there, what kind of feedback are you getting?
Well, you can ask Professor McCarthy, but this was actually based on animal data, some from McCarthy's lab and others. And we have recently shown this also in the human brain, but this hasn't been published yet. I hope it will be published soon. And the feedback, usually people are surprised because no one is thinking about this way. So usually we just list sex differences and we assume that sex differences add up. So the more differences we found, we believe that the sexes are more and more different. And what we've seen, and no one has looked at it before, is that the sex differences are not consistent. So you can be highly, extremely on the male side on some features and extremely on the female side on other features. I think this, I would, maybe Peg want to comment on this because this is derived from her studies also with rats.
Let me take you up on your advice and go to Professor McCarthy and ask her what she thinks of your theory.
Yeah, I think very highly of it. Obviously, since as Daphna said, Dr. Joel said, it's based on some of my own data. And actually what I find is that when people hear the notion, it actually is sort of an, oh, aha, of course. It's kind of intuitively obvious that there's no such thing as a male brain or a female brain, that all of us possess varying degrees of what we would call masculine and feminine traits. And that's why some men are very tender-hearted about some things and very hard-hearted about others, just as are women. Some women are high-risk takers and very aggressive about some things, but not about others. Again, each one of us, and if you think about it, again, coming back to an evolutionary basis for this, the reason that would be a good thing is that makes us all much more variable, right, and much more adaptive to our environment and able to respond to challenges. So when we drill down to the biological basis of what makes for sort of neuroanatomical and neurophysiological sex differences, we find that the mechanisms that evolution has used to create these differences varies for every single brain region that we look at. And that means that there's many, many more things to be acted upon by genetic variation, environmental experiences, mutations, insults, hormones, etc. And so really it kind of intuitively makes sense that it would be foolish to have only all the brains to be half male and all the brains to be female. I don't think we'd be as successful a species as we are if that were the case.
Jordan, before I get you to comment, let's take another look at an excerpt from the documentary which may help you formulate your response. Sydney, if you would, let's roll it.
A team of scientists in Philadelphia has mapped the microscopic connections within male and female brains. And what they found is astonishing.
The study indicates that those connections between the two hemispheres are much stronger and more prevalent in women than in men, and from here we can conclude that the ability to use both the verbal, analytic, and the emotional information is enhanced in women.
The neural pathways in male brains follow a strikingly different pattern.
What we see in males is stronger connections between the back and the front of the brain. The back of the brain processes the information and sends it forward to the brain, and the front of the brain decides puts it all together and decides what to do about it. So it indicates males have stronger ability to connect between what they see and what they do, which is essentially what you need to do if you are a hunter. You see something, you need to respond right away.
Although the scientists identified stark differences in men and women's neural pathways, they didn't find those differences in children. The differences only seem to develop in the teenage years, which means they could be the result of social pressure rather than innate.
Okay, that's what the documentary asserts. You've heard what Daphna Joel and Margaret McCarthy have to say. Where do you come down on this issue of a male brain versus a female brain versus a mosaic brain?
Well, I think if you're trying to address a question scientifically, that you have to drill down to a fairly high resolution level of detail. So you start asking about different behaviors and traits and attributes and look at the gender differences in each of them, and then you also try to see how those might clump together. And so I think that's the right level of analysis. It's trait and property by property analysis. Having said that, though, and in relationship to the documentary cut, there is a pretty good evidence, I think, that prenatal influences on brain development are very, very powerful and do produce differences, important differences in brain structure and behavior before birth. I think the evidence for that is actually overwhelming, partly because we know that testosterone actually transforms the fetus into a male. So that's the research, I think, that's most powerfully indicative of the idea that there are important differences in brain structure and function that, first of all, that exist and that can't be attributed to socialization. And we also shouldn't confuse differences in function with differences in evident brain anatomy, because there are parts of the brain, especially in places like the hypothalamus, which controls basic instincts, which are very, very small. And in that area, populations of several 100,000 neurons, which is no neurons at all compared to all the neurons you have in your brain, can make a substantial difference in your function, like massive differences in your function. So the size and magnitude issue is a tricky one.
Daphna Joel, can I return to something you said a few moments ago, which was, we seem to be obsessed with this notion of male brain versus female brain. We seem to need to have an answer to this issue of nature versus nurture. Do you think we should not be obsessed by this question?
Well, I think we should not be obsessed by the question. Are we obsessed by the question whether there is an essential difference between people with light skin color and dark skin color? Are we obsessed with this? This is not politically legitimate to even ask this question, is it? So why is it legitimate to ask the question whether males and females are fundamentally different? And I think the only reason to ask this question, and this is why we are obsessed with it, is we want to say that there are natural differences, because this justifies the different treatment of males and females in our society. And so this is a problem. And I think it may be important for some things, like, for example, for psychopathology or in medicine. But when we talk about behavior, there is no reason to look for the reason for the differences, because we don't need to justify them. So let's say there are differences, and let's say even we have a basis, a biological basis for this. So let's say we find that human males are indeed tend to be more aggressive than females. So what should we do with this fact, if we find it? There is no evidence for this in humans, but let's say it is true. So should we let men be violent towards other men and towards women, or should we actually educate men better not to be violent? Maybe we should just screen the population to people that have high tendency to be violent, males or females, even if there are more males like this, and just, give them special treatment not to be violent, because violence is not good in our society. And in fact, this is what we do. So we do not, aggression, of course, is natural. If you look at any animal, if it is disturbed, it is aggressive. But all our society is built not to allow this natural aggression to be produced. So we educate our kids from a very young age, and when we are older, we have police, we have courts, we have prisons. Everything that we do is against our nature. But then we come to the sex differences, and then we look for nature, for guidance. And we look for nature to allow these differences or to justify them. When in fact, even if there are a biological basis for these differences, we should act against these differences. So if we think that empathy is an important quality in our human behavior, then if men are by nature less empathic, we should treat them to be empathic. And if the ability to be assertive is important, then girls should be assertive too. This is why I think we are obsessed in this question just because we want to justify these differences. But this is a political issue. It's not a biological issue.
Margaret McCarthy, can I get your reaction to that?
Well, I can't argue with anything that Daphna said in terms of that, that's one interpretation, but it's also, so The reason that I study biological sex differences in the brain is there's two reasons. One is that it's a tremendous tool for learning how the brain develops normally. To return to the idea that early hormones, prenatal or early postnatal, impact how the brain's developed, we cannot understand something as complex as brain development if we don't understand it in both sexes, because we're finding that in some brain regions, such as the hypothalamus, it is profoundly different, and we discover new ways that nature has created to build a brain. And we would never have discovered them if we didn't compare males and females. Now, you say, well, that's interesting just from a very, very basic science point of view. But then, as Dr. Joel referred to, it does then tremendously illuminate what we're doing in biomedicine. It helps us to understand why males and females respond differently to some drugs. It's not just that their liver metabolizes them differently. Sometimes it's because their brain has a different circuitry or a different phenotype of receptors in one particular area, might use a different signal transduction pathway. So that's just for normal healthy individuals who might need some kind of medication. But more importantly is the huge gender bias in neuropsychiatric disorders. And so if we just break down the neuropsychiatric disorders along those that either have developmental origins or are diagnosed in development, those would be autism, early onset schizophrenia, dyslexia, stuttering. Not that those are neuropsychiatric disorders, I'm just saying those are just neurologically based events. Tourette's syndrome and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. All of those have tremendous male biases. Autism is now 5 to 1 more frequently diagnosed in boys to girls. ADHD is 10 to 1. And granted, that might have some cultural origins because we're less tolerant of busy little boys. But nonetheless, all of the developmental, or we don't have a single developmental neuropsychiatric or neurological disorder that has a female bias. But if we look at the adult onset disorders, the depressive, anxiety, obsession, compulsion, anorexia, bulimia, all the feeding disorders, those are all biased in the female direction. And importantly, in all of these cases, these hold worldwide. They are not, it's not just true for Western societies or something like so. So we can't say that these are also a cultural bias. They seem to have a biological origin. So I think there is a good reason to understand the biological basis of things such as aggression, which is a social behavior, and there are social behavior deficits in schizophrenia and autism, just as it's important to understand the biological basis of anxiety, of feeding, etc. And if we understand them in males and females, we have a whole wedge, a whole new searchlight at which to look for new therapies and new treatments.
Jordan, let me get you to take us right back to the beginning of a person's life. And I want you to tell us about a study done by Simon Baron-Cohen, Borat's cousin, right? Okay, Sasha's cousin, in which one-day-old infants are observed on how they react to objects and faces. What does the study tell us? Well,
boys don't react to faces as much as girls do, and they seem to be more attracted to movement. And according to Baron-Cohen, that's an example of testosterone, prenatal testosterone-induced differences in people versus thing processing, or he calls it actually empathizing versus sympathizing. And his body of research is quite powerful because he looks at prenatal testosterone levels in fetuses and then later, after they're born, correlates those levels with a variety of observable behaviors. One of them is eye gaze, but there are others. So for example, the increased testosterone is associated with increased like for rough and tumble play. That's another one. So, and the effects are actually quite large. So the importance of the study is that it's very difficult to associate that particular effect with a socialization explanation. I wanted to make a comment quickly on the issue of whether or not gender differences and racial differences, for that matter, are politically legitimate domains of inquiry. First of all, I don't think there are politically illegitimate domains of scientific inquiry. There's just scientific inquiry. I mean, with racial differences, for example, it's the case that the causes of elevated blood pressure, for example, in black Americans versus white Americans are not the same. Black Americans tend to be more salt sensitive than white Americans. And that actually happens to be an important thing if you're a black American with high blood pressure. And there are other differences in disease propensity as well. So for example, Jewish people, especially the European Jews, have a tendency towards an increased propensity of certain kinds of neurological diseases. And so you can't, there's no reason to ignore those. The question is, what do you do with the findings? And that's the moral issue. But part of the reason you want to get it right is because people take their guesses about gender differences, which are usually ideologically informed, and so they're global and not specified and usually not based on any data, and then they make political decisions that are predicated on them. And so in Scandinavia, for example, the presumption has always been that the reason that there are more female nurses than male nurses is because of socialization differences. And then the consequence of, you might say, so what? But the consequence of that is that there are continual movements by people who are obsessed with equality of outcome to ensure that that stops being the case.
Okay.
And you can think of that as a form of coercion. So
I get you. I'm going to leave the political discussion aside for the moment, because I really do want to follow up on the first thing you said and go to Daphna on that, because presumably if you're a day-old child, you haven't had the opportunity yet to be dramatically nurtured in the way to think or react or be. So all of the things that Jordan Peterson just said would seem to point to nature, would they not?
Well, if the study was conducted better, maybe this would be the result. But first, it was not things and faces. It was one face of the experimenter who was a woman and knew the sex of the baby. So we don't know whether maybe she reacted differently because she knew the babies and she was real. It wasn't a picture of her. And the other was a mobile of faces or parts of her face. So it's only one type of stimulus for each. And the other thing is that there was no significant difference between the time the babies, the male and female babies, looked at the faces. The significant difference was between the time the male and female babies looked at the object, at the mobile. So there was no difference between the babies in the time they looked at the faces. Now the other thing was that in girls, 10% of the time they looked at something else, which we don't know what it was. And this is the size of the difference between the time they looked at the objects, the boys and the males and female babies. So this study, although it was highly cited and although his title and abstract and everything is highly misleading because it depicts the results not as they were, it does not show what it's supposed to be shown. So I can't say much about this study. And in addition, what I can say is that also in this study, as in every other study that we know of humans, there was huge overlap between the distributions of males and females, even in the features that show the sex difference. That is how long they looked at the mobile. So also here we see some babies exposed to testosterone in the uterus, that is males, but they look a long time on their faces and a short time on the object, and vice versa. And this is the idea of the mosaic. The mosaic doesn't say that there are no sex differences, although it ignores the reason for the sex differences because I don't think they are important. But what it says that even in our society, when males and females are exposed to different levels of testosterone in the womb, and whereas from the moment we are born, there are gender effects on us, still humans do not possess either a male or a female brain, nor a completely masculine or feminine character. Everyone is a mosaic, having both masculine and feminine characteristics, both in behavior and in the brain. And I think if we remember this, we can stop treating humans as if they belong to two distinct and different categories. We are all one of a huge, highly heterogeneous population. Some people are higher on these features, some on others. And I think this is an important thing to understand. It's not about whether there are sex differences or not. It's about understanding that they do not add up to two distinct systems, as they do in the genitals. Only there we can really distinguish between people or divide them into two distinct types, those with male genitals and those with female genitals. But it doesn't work for brain or behavior.
Jordan, I don't think you made the sale.
Well, one of the things, first of all, there is major overlap in the sex differences. The populations of males and females are more similar on all traits than they are different. But that's misleading in some cases because some social phenomena are only driven by extremes. So for example, men are on average more aggressive than women. Although there's lots of women who are more aggressive than lots of men, and I'm talking about dominance aggression, not the kind that's defensive. Now, so imagine that what that means is that because men on average are more aggressive than women, if you look at the entire population of human beings and then you make the proposition that the most aggressive 1 in 20 people will be in prison, 1 in 100 really, 1 in 100 will be in prison, they're all going to be men. Despite the fact that, generally speaking, men and women are quite similar when it comes to aggression. And that phenomena occurs in many different domains of behavior, where the massive consequence of the difference is only really evident at the extremes. So in something like, we'll take this as an example, assuming the math genius distribution idea is correct, and there's more men that are impaired in mathematical skills and more men who are outright geniuses. It's the outright geniuses that drive all the innovation, even though there's a small number of them. So even though the gender differences don't have to be that big on average, if they're there at all and they tilt the curves, then you can produce a massive effect at the extremes. So,
okay, excuse me. Let me introduce the Darwin Awards. You all know what the Darwin Awards are, but for our viewers who may not, these are bestowed upon individuals who, quote, eliminate themselves from a gene pool in such an idiotic manner that their action ensures one less idiot will survive. Here's an example of some people who have won the Darwin Awards. There were 2 men who tried to take selfies with a wild elephant. Guess what happened? The wild elephant, of course, trampled them to death. Males make up 89% of the Darwin Award winners. This goes back to what Steven Pinker said about males being dramatically more likely to want to take risks. Margaret McCarthy, doesn't this say something innate about the male predisposition to engage in risky or even incredibly stupid behavior?
Oh, well, I don't know if it says definitively that it's innate, but I would agree that it certainly suggests that that's so. And we can look at risk-taking behavior in non-human primates and in fact see the same thing. They are in fact more likely to take risks on average. There is a great deal of variability amongst individuals within a rhesus monkey troop or baboons, with some individuals being high risk takers and others not. But it fits in with a whole, again, sort of evolutionary program of males are driven to take risks to further their reproductive success by garnering as many resources as possible, mating with as many females as possible. And again, I'm just speaking of the animal kingdom. Whereas females, they have to protect their few precious high investment eggs and make sure that they don't take high risks, because when they do, the cost to them outside of death, as in Darwin Awards, is much greater in terms of the investment they make. So it sort of if you interpret it in the light of evolution, it really makes perfect sense. And within individuals, you can correlate testosterone levels and risk-taking. Interestingly, we find that things such as winning in a contest will actually impact on testosterone levels in individuals. One great study everybody likes to quote was a World Soccer game, I think between the Brazilians and the Italians, I believe it was. And just in the spectators, they had them all spit into a cup before the match started, and they measured the testosterone, which you can measure in saliva, and it was equal between the Brazilians and the Italians. And this was just actually in a bar, not at the stadium. And then afterwards, they again spit in a cup, and the testosterone of the Brazilians who won had significantly increased, and the Italians who had lost had significantly decreased. So if you just sort of expand that to winning at a contest that you took a risk at, you can see it can become a rewarding behavior. So it can be a self-reinforcing phenomenon.
Interesting. Jordan, you know anybody who's won one of these Darwin Awards?
Nobody alive.
There you go. You probably could nominate some people. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, there's a couple of things about risk-taking in males I think that are interesting. There's a lot of them. I mean, one is that risk-taking really starts to differentiate males and females when testosterone kicks in adolescence. And the curves of male risk-taking, and by the way, also male creative behavior, track the testosterone spike pretty intensely. And so boys tend to become more delinquent, more disobedient, more likely to break laws, when they hit puberty, when testosterone spikes tremendously. And then by the time they're about 26 or 27, they tend to mellow out.
Because the testosterone levels
Well,
go
there's
down?
a variety of reasons, but that's one of them.
Okay.
Now, part of the reason that perhaps that men are more likely to take risks than women is because men compete to dominate male dominance hierarchies. And the reason they do that is because women preferentially prefer, mate with, males who are at the top of the dominance hierarchy, and the effect is not small. So there's a massive correlation between how successful, compared to other men, by standard measures of success a given man is, and how many women he has at his disposal, so to speak. Whereas there's no correlation between a woman's socioeconomic position and power and how many men she has at her disposal to sleep with. Zero. So the difference, there's a huge difference in motivation, because for men, mastering the male dominance hierarchy pays off not only in an increased quality of life in multiple domains and the probability of living longer and having healthier children and all sorts of things, but it also makes them far more attractive to women. And so that seems, under most conditions, to be tremendously worth taking a risk for.
Win-win situation.
Yeah, well, it also increases the probability that they're going to get killed by other young men. And that actually happens a lot in poor neighborhoods where the probability of climbing up a dominance hierarchy is flattened. So there's a lot of rich people, or a few rich people at the top and a lot of poor people at the bottom, and you can't climb. The adolescent males tend to get extremely aggressive, and they generally go after each other and generally within race.
Daphna Joel, I should give you a chance to comment on that if you want to.
Yes, I think this is very nice stories, but there is no good evidence. I mean, it's very descriptive, but it doesn't show that this is nature or biological. And if we go and look at our chimpanzees and bonobo, which are closest to us genetically, then males there copulate with many females, but also females copulate with many males, and it makes a lot of sense, because if no one knows who the father is, so they are all helping out with the kids or with the babies. And so the idea that the humans, it makes sense for a male to mate with many females, but it doesn't make sense for a female to mate with many males, it's a nice story. And again, it explains our society, but doesn't mean that it is true, right? So, and again, in your evolutionary theory to talk about the fact that if you want your sperm to proceed, then you need also, it's not enough to have many babies, you need to have them grown up and have your babies of their own, so you should invest time. But again, I said, it's all stories, and the fact that there is a difference doesn't mean that it is natural. And evolutionary stories, to explain it, we can also always give a different story from evolution, because there are many solutions in evolution to the same problem, which is that males have sperm and invest little in producing a baby, and females have the egg and undergo pregnancy, and then they have to nurse. So they have greater investment. But there are many different solutions to this problem in evolution. And assuming that the way our society is currently built is a result of evolution and necessary and only possible result of evolution, it's a political argument. It's not, doesn't make it a scientific argument.
Okay, Jordan, I know you want to come back at this. However, we're down to 15 minutes to go here. I got a bunch more things that I still want to get to. For example, perhaps the most significant debate of the past 20 years on this issue, which happened because the former president of Harvard University had something to say about men and women and math. And here's what he said. There is relatively clear evidence that whatever the difference in means, which can be debated, there is a difference in the standard deviation and variability of a male and female population. That was Lawrence Summers, who's of course former Treasury Secretary, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for Barack Obama, on why he thought men were better at math than women. And of course, when he said that, female professors at Harvard were extremely disappointed and upset, and I think some walked out on his speech when he said that. First of all, maybe could you translate into English what he just said, and then we'll go from there?
Well, it has to do with the argument I was making earlier about differences at the end of a distribution. So if there are more men who are very good at something and more men who are very bad at the same thing, it's because the males are more variable. And males have a tendency to be more variable in their behavior with regards to failure and success across many species. Now, so there was evidence that the average intelligence related to the phenomena that Summers was talking about was the same in men and women, but there was more variability in men, and that would put more men way out on the extreme that would lead them to go into occupations that require extreme specialization in math and engineering. So So there's that. I think the evidence is actually better, not so much for innate differences in those sorts of abilities, although his argument may hold. It's been taken apart by people like Elizabeth Spelke, but I think the better arguments are actually interest. I think that men and women do seem to be very similar in most cognitive attributes, but it is not clear at all that they're interested in the same things. And even if a woman is gifted mathematically, that doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to want to be a mathematician. It's a pretty strange life to be a mathematician, you know. So, and I think Summers got pilloried, unfortunately.
Well, Margaret McCarthy, let me ask the obvious question. Is he right in what he said?
So he said a number of things. He also suggested that perhaps women weren't interested in the hard working conditions that it took to exceed in science. And you know, the answers to that is try being a mother and a scientist at the same time. An 80-hour week is like a vacation. So it's all, you know, women, if they often will make different choices because they value family life and relationships and things. Many of the most successful men at that outer extreme, they can give up many of the daily life responsibilities by either not marrying or marrying in a situation in which there's not an equal share of the workload. And as you know, there are studies that show despite many, many women entering the workforce, there still is an unequal burden at home. So that was one of the things that he said that I think caused some of the women to walk out. What Dr. Peterson said is, it was quite correct that Elizabeth Spelke did do a beautiful job of sort of entangling all of the arguments and debunking many of the arguments about mathematical ability. But the conclusion was the same, that often women didn't choose these professions. And as he said, it could be because it's a strange life and it just might not be a life that they are seeking, that they value other things. And so it's an important distinction between ability and desire. And I think that's where the argument gets really important, is if you say that men have the ability and women don't, that's not actually well-founded in fact. But if you say that men have the desire and women don't, that does appear to be true. Now, is that because cultural conditions make it so difficult for women? Would women have the desire to have that career if in fact it was true that they wouldn't have to still do the majority of the housework and raise the kids, etc.? I don't know. That's an open question, and I think an interesting one. There is no denying the biology, and I can't believe I'm saying this because as a little girl, my father always told me biology is destiny, but now that I am a mother of two children, I do know that there is a difference between being a mother and being a father, and we play very different roles in our children's lives, equally important, but distinct roles. And not many women I know want to play the role of the father, and not many fathers I know want to play the role of the mother. And some do, and you know, there's more and more stay-at-home dads, which is a great thing. But as a choice, I think from the biology of having given birth and nurtured my children, I would choose to be the mom. So that's how complex it gets, really. As Dr. Joel said in the beginning, it is really almost impossible to disentangle nature and nurture on many of these complex questions.
Daphna Joel, if Larry Summers had said what he said not 10 years ago, but today, do you think the outcry would be as strong?
I don't know, especially I have no sense of what's going on in North America. But I do want to comment another thing. Again, we can always ask if it's nature, and if we trust that nature creates these differences, so why are we as a society reinforce these differences? And there has been a very nice study by the Israelis comparing the students' exam in regular school, students' exams in mathematics given by international exams, and what the grades that they got in the class. And they found that many teachers consistently give girl students lower grades compared to the international exam. So they are lacking the word. And they also showed that girls that went to such a teacher did less good or less well later in mathematics, and also wanted to study mathematics at the higher level less, because they had these encouraging teachers. So again, maybe by nature, males are better in mathematics, but then why, as a society, we drive males to mathematics and drive women against or away from mathematics? Why don't we just let nature do his thing? So the problem is, again, our social structure, which reinforces and creates these differences. Whether in a gender-neutral society we will still have these differences, no one knows. I don't know. Maybe there will be differences. But why do we care about them? Why, as a society, we are built to create or to enlarge these so-called natural differences? This is my question, and I'm keeping asking it, but I think this is the main question, because this is where we can actually make a difference. We cannot make a difference with what is natural. We can also make a difference in the environment that we are giving our kids and ourselves.
No, I do appreciate that, and one, I think, pretty prominent example, some of our viewers may have seen it on 60 Minutes, was the example, I think from a couple of years ago, where the American Food and Drug Administration ordered the makers of this sleep aid called Ambien, they ordered them to lower the dose in half, but only for women. Apparently the drug's been on the market for 20 years, and women were being, in some respects, overprescribed or overdosed of this drug. Margaret McCarthy, why do you think it took so long for the FDA to come to that conclusion?
Yeah, it took shockingly long, and in fact, it hasn't been a couple years. It's only been about 6 months, and it was because the number of incidences of adverse events involving women kept piling up. This is the first time they've ever had a drug in which they gave a gender-specific dosing, and hopefully it's not going to be the last. In the 10 most recent clinical trials that were withdrawn from the market due to adverse events, that was solely because of adverse events in women, in 8 out of 10 of them. Some of those were life-threatening adverse events. And again, it was because the foundational research that was done did not include male and female subjects, particularly at the preclinical level, meaning in our animal models. And there's been a disgraceful ignoring of sex as a biological variable in what we call translational research. Clinical research has been required since the early 1990s to have equal representation by gender and race and age, etc. But it's still, women are only represented about 30 to 35% in most clinical trials. So the FDA has now got a new task force to start looking at gender as a variable in approving different types of drugs. But this is just really an example, again, of why it is important sometimes to understand. You might not need to know the mechanism of why it acts differently in males and females or why the dose is different, but you need to know if it is. And the way one doctor put it to me, she says, how do you think men would respond if you prescribed them a drug and said to them, and by the way, this drug so far has only been tested in women? I doubt many men would be willing to take the drug. So that's part of the reasons that we're having a lot of these conversations right now about sort of making sure that our healthcare system is attending to everyone in the population.
Jordan, it does seem to be a pretty clear example of sexism in the way that these clinical trials were done. There was sort of it never occurred to anybody that men and women might react differently in different dosages to the same drug. Fair to say?
Yeah, well, there's complications there too, because one of the things that's unfortunately happened is that the participation of women in drug trials is often complicated by the fact that you have to take menstrual cycle timing into account. And so for a variety of practical concerns, which may or may not be well-founded given the limitations of scientific funding, it's often easier to use men. Now, there are obvious downsides to that.
Well, one of which we've just heard right here.
Well, of course, of course. But, you know, if the thing is, if you want scientists to pay more attention to producing representative samples of subjects, then you have to give them more money because it's much more expensive to do that.
Okay, here's a clip from a Norwegian documentary that we want to play. It's called The Gender Equality Paradox, and it asks the following question. Why is it that in Norway, which is one of the most, of course, egalitarian countries anywhere in the world, surprisingly large percentages of men and women chose traditionally gendered professions? Roll the clip, please.
The more you free people in society, the more you open opportunities for people to do anything they want, the more likely it is that any kind of genetic predisposition they have will be able to express itself.
In the gender egalitarian countries like Norway, you really are free to follow your inclinations. You know, in a poor country, you're probably worried just about getting a job. You just want a job. And if it's computers that are going to get you that job in India, for example, you'll go for it, even if you're a woman. But, you know, in gender egalitarian countries, North America and Europe, I think people feel freer just to pursue what they're truly interested in. And my point is, men and women are interested in somewhat different things.
Daphna, let me go to you on this for your reaction. Does this go against your position?
I think it's surprising. But I think, for example, in the video, because I saw the entire video, so they say that women have 480 days of vacation, of maternity leave, and men have 60. That's also for equality, right? So if we find later that women stay more with the kids, is this because this is what they want to, or this is because the law gives them 6 times as more days at home with the baby compared to the father? So I think, again, it is surprising. I am surprised by the findings there. But whether this is this clearly shows that there are still differences. Whether there are gender differences and sex differences, again, you will never get from me another answer, because it's not a gender-free society. And if it's not a gender-free society, we can't say that this is the effect of sex. There is still gender there. There are still expectations, different expectations of men and women. You can also see it by the laws that they have. And maybe there, women can quit from the 2 careers that we currently have to make. Because what happened is with feminism, it was very successful in bringing women out of the home, but it wasn't successful in bringing men into the home. And women were left with 2 careers. So now they have both to have a career and do things outside the house, and also to take care of the kids. And maybe, it's too much for many women. And maybe if they have to choose only one, they prefer to choose the kids. But maybe if men were also more at home, then women can have it both also. So we can't really tell what that this says, because it's not a gender-free society.
We're down to just a few minutes left here, so let me get Jordan and Margaret to both comment on this relatively briefly, if you don't mind.
Sure. Sweden and the Scandinavian countries are the closest to gender-free countries that have ever been produced. And the consequence of that with regards to certain occupations is precisely and absolutely the opposite of what the social constructionists would have predicted. The gender differences have got bigger. They're bigger for interest, they're bigger for occupational choice, and they're bigger for personality.
Do we know why?
Well, the woman in the documentary said it properly. What happens is that if you flatten out environmental variability, you reduce it to 0, all that's left is biological variability, so it maximizes. And one way of thinking about that is that allows people to follow their innate predispositions. And that can't be dismissed as a story. There's tens of thousands of people who've participated in these studies. And the most important thing is it precisely contradicts the social constructionist hypothesis.
Margaret McCarthy, let me give you the last word on this one.
Well, okay, my last word would be that this is an N of 1. It was one experiment, one society, one set of conditions, one homogeneous genetic population. I think it remains to be seen whether or not this would hold true in other cultures and other societies. I agree, it's a surprising finding, it's a striking finding, but for right now, it's an N of 1.
They say, though, Margaret, that toys today are more gender-specific than they were 50 years ago, which just goes against everything you think the way things ought to be. Why do you figure?
I don't think I would agree with that. Boys today are much more used to having a woman boss. They're much more used to seeing women in positions of power and authority. I think boys are much more at ease actually also being involved in feminine type activities, that they don't feel quite the need to never cry, never show their emotional side. I don't agree with that at all. I don't think we see very many John Waynes around anymore. I think boys are much more, and I think it's better for boys not to be channeled into such extreme male type behaviors, and that they feel that they have more choices and things to do with their lives.
And Daphna, I should give you just the last word on this issue, which is about kibbutzes. You are in a country where, if you live on a kibbutz, it's supposed to be extremely egalitarian without taking gender into account at all. Do you think that's had an effect on the gender differences between men and women who live and or were raised on kibbutzes?
It's a huge story and lots of things to say about this, so I don't think we can go into this, but the myth, it was a myth. Later studies showed that the myth of gender equality was a myth. It wasn't true also in the kibbutz, unfortunately. And today we don't have any more kibbutzim like we used to, so this is out of it also. But I want to make the point that gender equality and gender-free, it's not the same. So it can be equal, but it doesn't mean that it's gender-free. So we still have this stereotype of what's appropriate for men and what's appropriate for women. And the Scandinavian countries are not gender-free. They have equality. It's not the same.
I take your point. I want to thank all three of you for joining us on TVO tonight, not only for this discussion, but also to set up the BBC documentary that will follow our broadcast. Daphna Joel, chair of the Psychobiology Graduate Program at Tel Aviv University, thank you for being there for us on Skype from Tel Aviv, Israel. Margaret McCarthy, chair of the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, we thank you for being there from Baltimore, Maryland, and we wish your city peace going forward. And Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. Jordan, as always, good to see you again as well.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.